All right, so yeah, we're gonna do some like dark web, darknet, deep web, dark stuff. But also there's gonna be a lot of throwback. So for those who were around for BBSs and IRC and Usenet and all of that, you guys can have some fun too. So a little bit about myself. My name, as she said, is Benjamin Brown. I work for Akamai Technologies. There I mostly focus on dark web, cybercrime, and underground economy research. I also do advanced CISP trainings. I do incident response both internally for the company for security incidents, but also for our customers when they're under DDoS or somebody's trying to do an account checker campaign or something like that. Also, I get to be a general chaos monkey around the company, which is a lot of fun. Without the network owners or the product owners knowing it or expecting it, I can at any point just go in and wreck their shit and then come back, and help them make it more resilient, which is a lot of fun. So setting the framework for this talk, what is going to be in scope is anything to do with e-banking, e-commerce, digital currencies, digital marketplaces, and digital economies. What I'm not really going to be talking a whole lot about, in case you see like gaps in some of the history, it's because I'm not looking at general phreaking, cracking, hacking, and I'm mostly focusing on electronic, economic, or financial transaction related crime. So we'll start out with some definitions. The media likes to use all three of these interchangeably, but they do have distinct definitions. And I found this graphic is a great way to explain it for the year 2003. But now that there are a number of different emerging darknet frameworks, and these are the network topology frameworks and the sets of protocols for the darknets, there tends to be more and more overlaid dark webs on top of that. And the dark web would be like where you actually have a website component instead of just like a file sharing or encrypted databases on a darknet or something like that. And then of course, all of these are overlay networks, so they'll be laying on top of the internet. I'm not really gonna go into ad hoc mesh networks, that can be a whole separate talk. These are all networks that sit on top of the internet itself as we know it. All right, so we're gonna start way back in the beginning of financially motivated electronic crime with literal wire fraud. So I've got 3 stories to tell you. These are things that actually happened, and they are models for scams that you'll probably recognize that you've seen a lot. So the first is a network admin job scam. This is where a company says, hey, we're a training school for this major corporation, this name, and we've got it all over the walls. You come in, you pay us some money, and then we'll train you for a few months, and then we'll place you guaranteed in a job with this big name company. And you could help administer their new emerging networks. The way this game actually worked, and this happened all over the US and in Europe some, is that this company would maybe do a little bit of training. Sometimes they would keep putting you off. And then when the time came for you to have the job, they would tell you to go to the headquarters of the company. And this is a real company, so you go to the headquarters, and the hiring manager there says, we have no idea what the school is. We have no affiliation with them. There is no guaranteed job. I don't know what you're talking about. And of course, by then, the school has either skipped town or they are able to just keep pushing people off. The next one is, and we see this a lot in terms of wire fraud, is where you have international banks, in this case, banks in Paris and London, and then somebody goes in and tries to pose as another person who owns an account at one of these international banks and says, hey, I'm overseas, here's who I am, I got robbed, I need to get some money, so I need you to wire it to me at this address, and this would be somewhere, in this case it was in Turkey. Then that social engineering, bypassing their checks and being able to get money out of somebody else's account by posing as them, identity fraud. And the third story is on an actual wiretap. This was a set of gentlemen in India, and they went and put a wiretap into the communications network. And what they were doing is they were capturing any communications that had to do with the sale of narcotics. And what they would do is they would manipulate the price market by saying, oh, this is how much this person sold to this person for in this quantity, and they're able to manipulate the market that way. So does anybody have a guess for about the dates when these scams started cropping up? The late 1800s. So these were all telegram fraud. So you can recognize that these are still scenarios that go on today with modern networks, but people were doing them way, way back then on the telegrams and the electronic telegram switching. So that is to say, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. So any law enforcement agency will tell you that there are lots of new technologies coming out and lots of new tools, but in general, the motivations and the ways that criminals operate tend to repeat in certain patterns. All right, so now let's jump into the 60s with peace, love, and purchasing fraud. And this was pre-internet, of course, but there were some sets of mini networks, mostly between retailers or manufacturers and their supply chain. And what they wanted to do is, as much as they could, get people out of the equation. So they set up what are called electronic data interchanges. So you would have like a supplier of hard drives, and through the EDI system, they would get a purchase order from the producer of computers that needs the hard drives. So these purchase orders and the invoice and the payment would all go through the EDI network, and the hard drives would be shipped. The problem with this is that it was still pretty error prone, so a lot of employees had access to the system on both sides, and they were able to manipulate purchase orders and invoices to either embezzle funds or to steal items without it being noticed, because they could change the number of items that's shown as shipped. So to combat this, one of the first sets of network security controls were these external controls set up with value-added networks. And what this did is it made sure that any employee attempting to tamper with the communications in the EDI system would be locked out and flagged, and the changes that they made would be discarded. And this was some of the first instances of really outsourcing risk, is they would let this third-party value-added networks deal with all of the transactions. All right, so let's go to the next decade. This is the age of disco. I'm sure all of you are familiar with ARPANET. This is when it first really started coming about. And also banks and telecom systems started having pretty extensive networks as well. About 1969, 1970, we start seeing massive organized crime start perpetrating network and electronic fraud. And one of the major cases was the inventor of the blue box. Does anybody not know what a blue box is? Okay, so what a blue box is it allows you to generate a certain set of tones that allow you in the old phone network to be able to go ahead and make free long-distance calls. So there was this crime syndicate based in Las Vegas. I'm sure you can guess which crime syndicate it was. But one of their major businesses was bookmaking, or taking bets. So they had to use the phone a lot, and a lot of it was long distance to New Jersey and New York and Chicago. So they made a deal with Al Gilbertson to go ahead and produce a whole bunch of these, so they drastically reduced their costs in their betting industry by not having to pay for long distance fees, which back then was just ridiculous. In the next year, John Draper found that the Captain Crunch whistle that you got from the Captain Crunch cereal during that time was able to perfectly produce the 2600 hertz tone. So this was essentially a blue box and a whistle. It would allow you to just bring the whistle up to the phone, make that noise, and get your free long-distance call. And in the same year, Esquire published an expose on phreaking, and they also published blue box instructions, which for the time was really dangerous for them to do because it would get them in a lot of legal hot water. Luckily, they got away with it. Other media outlets like Frack, we'll talk about later, did not get away so easily. And I'm talking now about phone phreaking, which is committing fraud on the telecom networks. In the 70s is when it really started launching and becoming mainstream, but this had been going on since the 50s. And one of the major pioneers in that, Joy Bubbles, we're coming up on his 10th death anniversary, so I just want to give him a shout out, tell him I miss your stories. Yeah, he used to run regular call-in storylines where you would call into his conference line and he would tell you stories about his adventures through the old telecom networks and early movings through those and hacking through the systems, and it was just super interesting. So moving on to the next year, 1972, this was the first case that we know of using the internet to purchase and sell drugs. 1972. So some Stanford students in the artificial intelligence lab, the artificial intelligence lab was allocated a certain number of ARPANET accounts, and they started using these accounts to set up a small transaction of marijuana to their counterparts at MIT. And mostly this was because we can do it, they did it. It wasn't a large amount, it was mostly for proof of concept, but it was the first instance that we have of that. The real precursor to Silk Road, I would say. In 1973, we started seeing the first cases of massive financial fraud using electronics. Equity Funding Corporation of America, they were one of the first companies to move all of their bookmaking and all of their accounting into computers in electronic form. And they were perpetrating fraud, and this was across the board. This was the C-level, the upper management, the middle management. They were all in on it. And finally, an outside company came in, an early Deloitte, you would say, and audited and found that they had been doing this since 1964. And it was just, probably one of the largest early fraud schemes for electronic networks. Also, in the same year, a chief teller at New York's dime savings banks was caught using a computer to embezzle over $1.5 million. He was caught, so they were able to reverse those transactions. But again, this was one of the first and largest cases using a computer to steal funds. All right, so now we'll start looking at the proto-darknets. These are darknets that were darknet by early definition, but weren't built to be a darknet. So when we had ARPANET that started cropping up between the US government and between different universities around the country, there started to crop up other networks outside of it. Now, for security reasons, since ARPANET was military research, they would push out information to these other networks, but those other networks could not respond back to ARPANET. So they were called in the 1970s darknets because they couldn't talk to ARPANET. Some of them would die, of course, out of not being maintained or not enough funds, but the ones that did stay around, those are what essentially became the core of the internet going forward. So the 80s and 90s, this was when everybody started getting access to the internet, and it became a real Wild West because it's also where early e-commerce and early electronic communications really started booming, and there wasn't a whole lot in the way of security to go along with it. We started seeing the rise of hacker collectives. Instead of just being, single people that were perpetrating fraud or crime electronically, we started to see groups really start to form cohesively. Some of the big names that came out of this era was Masters of Deception, Legion of Doom, Chaos Computer Club, which is still going strong, Cult of the Dead Cow, they're still hobbling along, Loft Heavy Industries, most of those guys you can still find in the Boston area, and if you go to any of the conferences there, they'll crop up. Firm, and then the Chinese Honker Union was probably the largest out of all of these collectives. We also started seeing hacking gain massive media exposure. And this is where we started to see the term hacking be conflated with cracking, where early on hacking was just about discovery and about finding out how systems work and what you could do to them to make them operate in different ways, and it was about intellectual curiosity. And then now the term started to be taken on by the media and used to mean mostly illegal or damaging acts that were using computers. So, of course, war games, sneakers, and the hackers movies really pushed a lot of this to the forefront of people's minds. And many governments, banks, and large name companies were hacked or had their web presence impersonated for phishing attempts or things like that. Again, the security was just abysmal at this point. There were a lot of telecom and TV stream hijacks too. One of the most famous ones for the TV streaming would be the satellite Sky TV. It was one of the first satellite TV setups, and that stream got hijacked multiple times. They had this back and forth battle with a hacking group. And then, of course, the overpowering TV stream interruption in Chicago, which nobody knows to this day who actually did it, but it was pretty impressive. We also saw a lot of both readers and journalists starting to become more technically adept so that they could stomach this more technical sort of reporting. And then, of course, we saw massive government responses to this new threat. In 1981, Interpol held their first training seminar for investigators of computer crime, and a lot of different law enforcement agencies created their computer task forces out of this seminar. In 1984, the US introduced Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which included a specific component for computer-related crime. That was expanded later into the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is a horrible, horrible law. It is very, very broad, and it's just been used extensively from then until now, in very abstract fashions. Also in the same year, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they published their recommendations on combating computer-related crime. And in 1989, this is probably one of the most important ones from that era. The Council of Europe released their recommendations of 1989, and this was the base framework for most Europeans' computer crime laws. In 1990, based off of that, the UK released their Computer Misuse Act. And in 94, I'm going to butcher this, I'm very sorry, Poznania hosted the Legal Aspects of Computer-Related Abuse conference. Again, that was backed by the Council of Europe, and a lot of task force either grew or came out of that directly. And then in 1997, the Polish Penal Code of 1997 was incorporated, and that added a whole bunch of computer-related fraud and crime recommendations. In 1998, the G8 set up a 24/7 hotline for high-tech crime investigation. A lot of law enforcement agencies didn't have the payroll to be able to take on a computer expert. So with this hotline, regular detectives were able to call in and get expert advice from the experts they had on staff. All right, so now we move from the proto-darknets to the quasi-darknets. And these are quasi-darknets in that you couldn't just go to a search engine and find them or find the content about them. They weren't built with privacy in mind. They didn't have encryption ingrained, anything like that. But they were secretive in that you had to know directly where you were connecting to, and you had to have specialized software to do so. The bulletin board system. So they're actually still around, mostly for nostalgia reasons, but they are where we really start seeing this network-based cybercrime groups really starting to communicate and share knowledge and starting to set up small mini marketplaces. Typically, if you heard somebody talking about or you read about an elite BBS, this was a bulletin board system that was usually closed. You had to apply for a membership so they could make sure you're not a Fed or you're not a noob or something like that. They were very elitist. And most of these, the discussions centered around wares, phreaking, hacking, cracking, credit card fraud, ID fraud, things like that. One of the major groups that came out of this is Razor 1911. They're still around, still going strong. Fairlight also came out of this. And these are groups that would regularly, right as it came out, crack software and then make it available to the public for free. Also, shout out to a Polish group. So out of that cracking scene came the demo scene. This was using low bit, low res hardware and software to create graphics and music and intro videos. And Accelerate was one based in Poland, and they were pretty big on the scene. So throw out to them. Of course, there's going to be law enforcement reprisals, right? So in 1990, it's what was called the Great Hacker Crackdown. And the largest of these series of global operations was Operation Sun Devil. And this was the FBI in tandem with the Secret Service and a lot of other law enforcement around the globe. They were targeting specifically these elite BBSs and the frack e-zine that produced a lot of the how-to hacking guides at that time. This was sort of the proto-2600. And this had a massive chilling effect. A lot of elite BBSs shut down of their own accord because they didn't want to have the heat. And we started to see the next few years a real decrease in BBS use. And of course the crackdown was one reason, but we also saw massive speed increases, which made the internet more appealing because it had subboards, hubs, and chats, and you could have multiple services with just one connection, where with the BBS you had to have multiple lines to connect to multiple BBSs. Also around the same time, but a little later in starting, Usenet newsgroups. Still around. If somebody tells you that it's a great place to get pirated software, don't, because it's very easy to track. ISPs just can sit there and look at it. It really was where we started first seeing massive spam campaigns. And also sporgery came out of this. This is spam campaigns that induce forgery. They act like they're being sent from somebody else, somebody you might trust. And then we also started to see out of these spam campaigns large-scale bot wars between the spammers and the admins. The first iteration of this was the spam bots versus the cancel bots. The admins would set up cancel bots to try and automatically catch and destroy the spam bots. And then this evolved into the spam bots also having forged cancel requests. So when they got hit by a cancel bot, they would go in and cancel the entire news group. And so the admins, to combat that, they would set in aliasing out bots, which would, whenever that was triggered, they would completely black hole wherever the bots were coming from. And then it was this constant arms race and back and forth. About 1994 is when we started to see a massive decline in these news groups. AOL gets a lot of the heat for this because in '93 it was the Endless September. This was where they really did a huge push to get lots of users and lots of users using their Usenet news groups. So there was a massive influx of noobs on the Usenet groups, and these little communities that had built themselves and were pretty cohesive were now just getting flooded by people who didn't really know what they were doing, were just posting willy-nilly, there was a lot of mess there, and the communities were broken up in a lot of ways. There was also a lot of disk and bandwidth usage that was increasing, so ISPs started to look at it and say, this isn't really worth it for us to host these anymore, it just costs too much. And then, of course, around the same time, the New York Attorneys General really started a massive anti-Usenet campaign because there were groups that were trading in child pornography and child abuse images. So a lot of ISPs after that just shut off their Usenet service so they didn't even have to worry about law enforcement. One of the tools that a lot of these spammers used, this one was hands down the most famous one, f-k̒n's news agent. And what this did is it allowed any user to pose as an administrator for a news group. You could auto-cancel any postings. You can replace the body of any message, which allowed you to do, of course, more targeted spamming. And whenever one of your posts were removed, it would automatically repost it for you. Also, it just gave various admin powers, like being able to kick people out or add people, things like that. All right, IRC. Oh man, I spent way too much time on IRC. So IRC was like Drama City. This was, there were massive forks, Dalnet from Fnet from one of the earliest IRC nets. Lots of NIC collisions, people taking over other people's names. Lots of forced net splits. This is where you cause the network to actually be split, usually through load balancing and across geographies, and then you could take over operation of a channel by forcing a net split. There was, of course, a lot of sharing of wares, music, movies, scanned books, lots of pornography, malware, bots, and actually drug-related sales channels. And there were a lot of games that we would play, like Spot the Fed. Of course, everybody called everybody else a Fed whenever they got in an argument. Mute the Noob, if somebody was like, how can I hack, or can you help me change my grades, or something like that, they would get muted. And then red flag keyword seeding. This was way before Edward Snowden. This is a game we would play, and that whenever we were talking to each other, we would just seed our conversations with red flag words for the NSA. And these were like, words like bomb or terrorist, or just in the middle of our sentences. And looking back on it, it was really dumb, but it was fun. And of course, along with the quasi-darknets are the peer-to-peer networks, and these were focused on file sharing. There was no web component to these, and that you couldn't have a site, and they weren't really privacy-oriented, but they were separate and overlay networks for the internet. And I'm sure a lot of you recognize some of these. And I'm sure a lot of you got malware from some of these. The one I missed the most was the community for SoulSeek. That's a little blue bird. I found so much great new music from around the globe, and like little small people who produce their own music would get on there, and it was just wonderful. Sorry, a little aside there. Also, I can't mention quasi-darknets without mentioning SneakerNet. So SneakerNets are mostly found in developing countries, but a lot of developed countries in certain areas still have active SneakerNets. And this is where you're not actually using the internet or a connected network, but you're hand trading data, or you're moving it from phone to phone by using a close connection. And Cuba has a huge one, Mexico has one, a number of different places in South America. China has a gigantic one. And there are a few in the northwest of the US and in California, but those are more like hipster, we're doing it because we can. And this leads us into the first crypto wars. This was all about intelligence gathering, containment of the communist threat, and also the rise of e-commerce and e-commerce protection. So of course this was the Cold War, which I don't think we ever left. And COCOM was established after World War II. This is the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. And one of the important things about this, oh, by the way, Poland was one of the 17 members along with the US. But one of the really important changes here is that they listed cryptography as a munitions under export control, so that cryptography was essentially equated with a weapon. In the early to mid 1990s, there was growing international e-commerce, and they wanted to protect their customers and their transactions, so they wanted to start using cryptography, of course. And there was a lot of lobbying that went into that, and there were eventually relaxations of the encryption export controls. Not adequate relaxations, because it left people having to use really weak encryption regimes, but it was better than nothing. Also, special call out to the efforts by Netscape and the PGP project. They were major voices in that move. And in 1996, the Wassenaar arrangement, this replaced COCOM, and it made some changes to how encryption and cryptography was listed in the export controls. So there was a general software note that gave exceptions for mass market and public domain cryptography, but it wasn't widely adopted. Australia, France, New Zealand, Russia, and the United States completely disregarded it and continued the tight control on crypto export. In 1998, there was a series of revisions to the Wassenaar Agreement that made for free for export symmetric crypto up to 56 bits, asymmetric crypto up to 512, and subgroup-based crypto like EC up to 112 bits. Also, mass market symmetric cryptography up to 64 bits was then made free for export. Of course, to us now, with the power computing power that we have, these numbers seem like a pittance. But at that time, they were better than nothing, of course. And then export of all other crypto regimes required a special license. All right, ClearNet markets. So quick rundown, these are the predecessors to the darknet markets, and, but they weren't on special encrypted darknets with privacy as a focus. In 2000, the counterfeit library was a diploma mill and ID fraud resources market. In 2001, a huge forum, Carter Planet, lots of especially Eastern European users, but also Western users. There was a major focus there on credit card fraud. And then out of that came Shadow Crew, which got a lot of media attention. And that evolved from the counterfeit library and Carter Planet. And they instituted something that wasn't seen before. It was a verified vendor service. So you could tell whether you could trust a vendor or not. But if that vendor paid the admins enough money, it didn't matter. They dealt mostly in stolen data, credit cards, ID fraud, and guides on how to do these things. Between 2003 and 2005, there was a major global law enforcement crackdown on these ClearNet markets. Operation Firewall and Operation Anglerfish were the two largest, arguably. And there were lots and lots of forum shutdowns. But of course, inevitably, when you shut down the few large concentrated markets, it just causes a whole bunch of other smaller ones to crop up. So one of these, out of all of the new ones that cropped up, was Carter's Market. But the admin of that, Iceman or Max Butler, some of you may very well have heard of him, what he was doing is he was going around to all the smaller markets and hacking them, stealing their databases, and forcibly merging them with his, so that people had to log into his website. From 2007 to now, most of these fraud forums don't last a year. They're hacked or they're shut down by law enforcement, so it's this constant whack-a-mole for fraud forums now. Law enforcement and researchers can't just go to one or two forums and do the research that they need, or be able to pick and choose the big fish. They have to deal with up and down markets all the time. So in order to facilitate these markets, we started seeing the introduction of digital currencies. These started with the backed by gold currencies. They were pegged to the gold standard. eGold was one of the first ones. Pecunix, iGolder, those were the three largest ones. By now, they're all effectively defunct. And then we started to see, when those went down, Liberty Reserve really just took over the entire market. They were dubbed the Black Market Bank. very popular in criminal forums, and they were involved in lots of large-scale money laundering from huge bank thefts, drug trades, things like that. And then we saw the move to cryptocurrencies. There are a couple out there. And this is actually from about 6 months ago, so there are even more than this. Of course, the biggest one, Bitcoin. It was released in 2009 by who knows. It's currently the largest by market value and the primary darknet market currency. But it does have an open ledger with full transaction visibility, so if anybody ever tells you that Bitcoin is anonymous, smack them. So one of the other alt currencies that came out of Bitcoin was Litecoin. It was a fork of the Bitcoin code. It was released in 2011 by Charlie Lee, and it is now the 4th largest by market value, and some darknet markets will accept Litecoin. Ethereum is one of the fast risers. It was released in 2015, 2nd largest market value. It is much more complex than Bitcoin, as it provides a decentralized Turing-complete virtual machine and its own coding language for it to be developed into other applications and wrappers and things like that for other blockchain-related activities. One of the new kids on the scene that's really blowing up, Monero. This was a cryptocurrency that was built with privacy in mind. It uses the CryptoNote protocol, and right now it's the 6th largest, but it's also the fastest growing cryptocurrency. And it's gaining acceptance among a number of darknet markets. All right, so now we're at the modern darknet market. Or modern darknets. These are the darknets that were specifically made to be darknets. Privacy-oriented. Some of the first ones, they had no website component, like you couldn't build a website on it. It was just file sharing, chat, communication, that sort of thing. The 3 largest to come out of that, OneSwarm, Tribbler, and RetroShare. RetroShare is defunct. OneSwarm is still kind of hobbling along. And then we have the actual darknet markets that have site components. There's Freenet, Riffle project from MIT, of course Tor, Netsukuku, which you'd think was out of Japan. No, that's out of Italy. I2P, huge, NewNet, and ZeroNet. Tor, as conspiracy theorists like to point out very loudly, it was originally a US Naval Research Lab and DARPA project, but then was released publicly in 2002. It uses multi-layered encryption, onion encryption, aimed for anonymous communication. It is definitely the largest for darknet traffic and the largest platform for darknet markets. Freenet was specifically built to focus on censorship-resistant communication and free speech for those who would be targeted by oppressive regimes or by censorship of any form. It uses a key-based routing protocol to go ahead and also have anonymity, but also keep the nodes up in case other ones get taken down. I2P was based on a very similar code base as Freenet. It was released in 2003, and it can also act as an anonymous network layer for other protocols. Like you can run FTP through it, you know, the other normal protocols. And it uses an extension of the onion routing. It uses what's called garlic routing, which is a series of, I guess, nodes of onion routing sources instead of just one large onion routing schema. NewNet, this one, of course, it's open source, new. And in order for it to be a darknet, it requires the friend-to-friend protocol network topology turned on. And it really started gaining popularity after the Edward Snowden Prism leaks. Netsukuku is kind of in limbo right now. It's version 2.0 in development, but what's neat about it is it has its own custom routing protocol and its own DNS system, which have some pretty neat features in and of themselves. It's still in alpha and there hasn't really been any large-scale testing, but it's a great idea. ZeroNet was based on Bitcoin crypto and the BitTorrent network together. And what they're aiming for is that you can never, ever, ever take down one of the sites that's put up on ZeroNet. So far, that's been the case. We'll see if that holds. And the newest kid on the block is the Riffle network being developed at MIT. It was introduced in 2016, and they claim that it will be 10 times faster than Tor and more secure than Tor. That waits to be seen because it's still in very, very pre-alpha and in development, and there hasn't been any large or even medium-scale testing for it. So now that these dark nets themselves started to emerge, we started to see darknet markets start to crop up on them. One of the first ones was the farmer's market. This started as a ClearNet market called Adam Flowers, and it used Hushmail to do all of its communications, which is encrypted email. It was the first to move to Tor, and it changed its name to the farmer's market, and it was the first true darknet marketplace. It had retail-like customer service. It accepted cash, PayPal, Western Union, Pecunix, and iGolder, those digital currencies we talked about earlier. And it had about 3,000 users at its peak over 55 different countries. And it focused solely on drugs. There was nothing else on there except drugs. Of course, in 2012, Operation Atom Bomb, the US Drug Enforcement Agency and law enforcement in Netherlands, Colombia, and Scotland all worked together. Also, it wasn't publicly stated, but based on the indictment papers, that it's pretty clear that somehow they gained access to the Hushmail accounts. It's believed that Hushmail worked with law enforcement. They've done it before. And that they were able to then do controlled delivers, package interceptions, and things like that. It ended up in 8 different indictments with 7 convictions. One of the indictees did not make it to court. He ended up dying of a heart attack. And the lead defendant, Mark Williams, was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is the largest sentence of its time, of its kind at the time. Silk Road. All right, so I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Silk Road and then all the mess that went down around that. The Dread Pirate Roberts and Scott Ulbrich getting the longest sentence. He's serving life without the option for parole. And there are still ongoing investigations into suspected law enforcement corruption and Bitcoin theft during the investigation of the Silk Road. Atlantis, this is notable. This one was notable because it was the first to offer Litecoin support, and it started allowing more than drugs. So fraud-related stuff, stolen product keys, stolen login accounts, things like that started to crop up here first. And it was possibly the first exit scam. That's where they allow a lot of money to be put into the escrow, and then they skip town with it. So they're also notable because they were the first to have their own marketing video. Oh, no sound. I know the sound's not working. But anyway, you should go look that up. It's pretty hilarious. It looks like a Web 2.0, startup company. All right, so the current state of the darknet markets is we're in a bubble. There's been a lot of exit scams, a lot of law enforcement takedowns, a lot of them have been hacked, and a lot of them we don't know why they disappeared. But even given all of that, there's still probably 40-ish darknet markets out there now. So yeah, that takedown of Silk Road, it really did a lot of good. The 3 largest right now are, without a doubt, Alphabay, Dream Market, and Hansa. After Agora and Nucleus did their exit scams. What can you get on these darknet markets? Drugs, precursors, lab equipment, stolen data, retail streaming and bank accounts, counterfeit goods, money IDs, diplomas, pirated software, malware, botnets, hacking for hire, crime tutorials. You can get weapons, but they're usually overly priced, and the chances of it being law enforcement on the other end are pretty high. Either that or it's a scam. So especially in the US, it's just a lot easier to go to a gun retailer. You can also buy other stuff. Sorry guys, they only ship to Europe. It ships from the Netherlands, but only to Europe, so if you're not from the EU, you're out of luck. You can also buy sand. The description, like from the motherfucking beach, yo. This was actually really hilarious because a lot of the reviews were like 1-star terrible reviews because they were like, he actually sent me sand. What the hell? They thought it was drugs. All right, so what do we see for the future? Dark Wallet is coming out. It's in extreme alpha, and what it's doing is it's focusing on making Bitcoin actually anonymous and privacy-oriented by doing stealth transactions, which uses a really cool Diffie-Hellman implementation. You should go look that up. It's really cool. And multi-signature co-op wallets for markets, built-in escrow capabilities, again, great for markets, and coin-join mixing, which is like tumbling Bitcoins. Dash, formerly Darkcoin, it uses network premixing, tumbling, and the X11 chained hashing algorithm, as opposed to SHA-256. And it's the 5th largest market value. I would put money on this being accepted by darknet markets in the next year or so. The developers of Shadowcoin, another privacy-oriented cryptocurrency, and Umbra, this is a platform for chat, market, mobile, and currency manipulation. They've moved to Particle, which is interesting because they're really moving into we're a real startup where we have real VC funders, we have a marketing team, we have lawyers, and it's a decentralized privacy platform for e-commerce based on the Bitcoin code base. They've already gotten a lot of money in development round funding. That's what they want it to look like. Looks sleek. Another very similar set of platforms, Zcash and Komodo. Zcash, again, it uses a zero-knowledge proof to verify transactions and scrubs metadata, so it's supposed to be more secure. The CEO is Zuko Wilcox O'Haron. So, like, in terms of security and cryptography, this guy really knows what he's doing. So having his name attached to it is a lot of credibility. Komodo. What's different from Komodo from the previous platform is that it also has a decentralized cryptocurrency exchange system and a pegged asset exchange, which lets you exchange cryptocurrencies for real currencies using the Komodo coin as a medium, which we haven't seen that before. That hasn't been something like Coinbase that makes you give them all your information. Operation Playpen. All right, so this is a really, really scary operation by the FBI. It was an anti-child abuse operation, and they seized a darknet forum that was a child pornography website, pretty much, and they ran it for 2 weeks to catch users. The way they did this is they got a single warrant that was supposed to only be used for targeting people in a section of Virginia, and they used that warrant to infect over 8,000 computers in 120 different countries, which is, of course, made the warrant eventually invalid, but a lot of the cases that they built, they ended up having to drop and letting the people go because they refused to reveal the malware and the exploits they used on their Tor clients. And what came out of that is now the Department of Justice is pushing a change to Rule 41 that would allow for the FBI and other law enforcement agencies to get what's called global hacking warrants, to where they can get one warrant to do massive global hacking and authorize like hacking of botnet zombies, so somebody who's innocent and doesn't know that their computer's infected can get taken over by the FBI. It also allows the FBI to do judge shopping. If they find a judge that doesn't want to give them the warrant because they think it's a fishing expedition, they can just go find another judge that might be more friendly to them. Of course, the EFF is up in arms about this and fighting the changes. The UK Investigatory Powers Act, even scarier. It's also called the Snoopers Charter. You should go look it up. There's a lot to go over and I'm running out of time. Yeah, you should go look up. But that essentially gives police the power to carry out targeted hacks and data interception and allows for bulk hacking in the name of national security. And the controls on that are very, very limited. It's very sketchy on what they have to prove in order to get that. And notifying an end user that they're being tapped by the government has now been declared a criminal offense. So does that mean we're now moving into Crypto Wars 2.0? Here we see the NSA pushing NIST, and they paid RSA to accept a dual EC crypto standard that had a built-in weakness allowing for RNG prediction. So it was essentially a backdoored. The FBI, of course, with the San Bernardino case, asking a judge to force Apple to compromise their own encrypted device, which eventually, thankfully, they were allowed to stop. Also, lots of governments are calling for encryption backdoors that can only be used by law enforcement. Yeah, and I want a unicorn. That's not going to happen. Also, there's a lot of warnings of the threat of encryption. A lot of countries want to start banning end-to-end encrypted communication devices and software because of terrorism, that big general boogeyman. So, all that brings us to what will all of this mean for the future of the internet, darknets, privacy, and security for both criminals, but also regular citizens. If we are moving into Crypto Wars 2.0, where is our privacy around e-commerce going? Where is our privacy around communication and individual transactions going? What are we looking at for the future? All right, questions? Is there time for questions? Okay. Sorry, I had to run through the last few. So if you're still digesting, please take down my contact information. The bottom's my Twitter, and then of course my email address. And I would be more than happy to get you a copy of the slides, to talk to you more about any of the points in there, or to, if you just want to tell me something cool you found that wasn't in here, that was related, I of course welcome that. All right, thank you.